Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today in the second webinar in our Garden Problem Solving series. My name is Ariel Whiteley-Knoll. I am the horticulture agent for K-State Research and Extension here in Shawnee County, and I will be your hostess for today's program. This program is brought to you by the Shawnee County Extension Master Gardeners who serve as volunteers for K-State Research and Extension. As the first land grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, K-State acknowledges that the state of Kansas is historically home to many Native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized Native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and Sac and Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. K-State Research and Extension programs and materials are open to all, without regard for race, color, national origin, sex, gender, gender identity, religion, age, height, weight, disability, political beliefs, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. Today's program, Insect, Mite, Pests of Landscapes, will be taught by K-State entomologist Dr. Raymond Cloyd. Please remain muted during Dr. Cloyd's program, but feel free to put any questions you may have in our chat box. One of our Extension Master Gardeners, Kevin Seek, will help to moderate the chat. At the end of the program, we'll have an opportunity for a Q&A session with Dr. Cloyd. We will record today's session and post it on our website, so look for that email tomorrow morning along with a short post-programmatic survey. Our survey collects required demographic information and valuable feedback that help ensure we can continue to provide the same quality programs moving forward. We would really appreciate you taking just a few minutes to complete that survey when you do receive it tomorrow. Now, I would like to turn the program over to Dr. Raymond Cloyd to talk with us about insect and mite pests in the landscape.
Thank you, Ariel. I'm going to share my screen. We go. Okay, how we doing? There we are. Let me get the slideshow. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. I can't see anybody at this point, but still, we're going to provide some valuable educational information that's both fun and enlightening. And today's presentation is going to be on insect and mite pests of landscapes. So this is what I look like today. This is not a green screen. That is Venice when I visited many years ago. And off to the right would have been the Rialto Bridge. I do highly recommend, if you have the opportunity, to visit Venice somehow. It's a very amazing place. With that being said, now that you know what I look like, let's get into an overview of the presentation. First of all, I'm going to give you a brief introduction. Then we're going to talk about the types of insect and mite pests of landscapes, their associated feeding behaviors, which results in their potential damage. And then I'll get into some plant protection strategies. I can't cover all of them, but I do want to use one insect as an example of some of the potential strategies that can be implemented when dealing with insect and mite pests of landscape, trees and shrubs, and also perennials, annuals, those sorts. I'm going to focus a little bit on trees and shrubs because that's where we deal with in most cases. If you do have a question about perennials, annuals, please feel free to hold the question and we can address it at the very end, that's when we'll have question and discussion section. So you all ready? Here we go. Well, the first question I always get is, how did this winter affect insect and mite pests? I drove in at 4:30 one morning. It was minus 16 degrees in February in Manhattan, Kansas. It was cold. The problem is insects have their own means of dealing with winter temperatures. And a snow cover provides good insulation for insects. And so although the ambient air temperature might be minus 16, the soil temperature might be 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, insects and mites overcome winter temperatures by going through what we call the overwintering phase. What does overwintering mean? Overwintering is a physiological condition of growth retardation or arrest that is primarily designed to overcome lower than optimum temperatures during winter or even summer. Okay, so the insects in the wintertime their metabolism is low, they're not even eating, they're just sitting there waiting for the temperatures to warm up and consequently for the plants to put out new growth. Well, Insect and mite pests can overwinter as eggs, nymphs, larvae, pupa, or adults. In general, aphids and mites overwinter as eggs, and they can overwinter in the soil, on plant parts, or in debris. Larva pupa, that's caterpillars and wood-boring insects, which we'll talk about. And then beetles and true bugs tend to overwinter as adults. And some of these, of course, as you know, come into your house in the wintertime to escape the winter temperatures, especially when they really, really get cold, like minus 16 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way. Okay? So what are the overwintering life stages of insect and mite pests? Well, bagworm, as we'll talk about in depth, overwinters as eggs. Aphids overwinter as eggs. The eastern tint caterpillar overwinters as eggs, as an egg mass on apple trees and any plants in the Rosaceae family. Elm leaf beetle overwinters as adults. They sometimes come into people's homes. Fall webworm as pupa. Japanese beetle as larva. Japanese beetle populations are declining. Grasshoppers overwinter as eggs. Lace bugs, which are out there now, overwinter as eggs or adults. And the two-spotted spider mite overwinters as either eggs or adults. So each insect or mite has an overwintering stage, and some of them actually have more than one, depending on the conditions. Okay? So I just want to give you a brief overview that cold temperatures that we had in February probably didn't result in high mortality of insect pests because you have to have a long duration. If you really want to impact insects, the temperatures have to be around minus 16 to 20 degrees for about 2 weeks. And I know that's pretty harsh, but that's what it takes because the insects and mites have these resilient stages that will allow them to survive those types of winter temperatures. So with that, I just wanted to give everybody kind of an introduction overview of how insects and mite pests overwinter, because those are some of the questions we had early on this year. So let's talk about, there are many insect and mite pests that feed on trees and shrubs and landscapes, okay? This is just a gallery. Over here on the left is mimosa webworm, two-spotted spider mite, fall webworm, eastern tint caterpillar, elm leaf beetle, and one of the many, this is probably Lecanium scale. So we have different types of insect and mite pests. We have our early feeders and our later feeders. Our early feeders are eastern tint caterpillar. These are probably out about April and May. European pine sawfly, spruce spider mite, lilac borer, European elm flea weevil, and different types or species of aphids. Okay, they come on early when plants are just coming out with their new growth. Then we have the kind of later feeders, you know, let's say late spring to about fall. Bagworm, two-spotted spider mite, mimosa webworm, fall webworm, elm leaf beetle, Japanese beetle, scales, different types, leaf hoppers, and wood-boring insects, okay? So this gives you sort of an overview of the types of insect mite pests and whether they're going to come out early, and that's going to depend on temperature. The colder the temperature, the later they'll come out, and those that are going to be more problematic later on in the growing season, mid-spring or early spring till all the way to fall. So the feeding behaviors of insect and mite pests are based on their mouth parts. The chewers include caterpillars, beetles, weevils, and sawflies. Suckers are also referred to as person sucking because of their mouth parts, includes aphids, scales, spider mites, leafhoppers, psyllids, and whiteflies. The chewers are physically removing plant tissue, and the suckers are piercing sucking. These insects and mites have mouth parts that are removing the nutritional content of plants in the phloem sieve tubes or in the cells, and that basically robs the plant of its ability to obtain food, and consequently results in certain types of symptoms as a result of that feeding behavior. So a couple of questions that you should be asking yourself when identifying insect and mite pests and then determine the extent of the potential plant damage is what is the seasonality of the insect and mite pest? When are they present feeding on plants? And that's why I brought up that early and the late feeders, because you can use this as a guide. You know, the eastern tint caterpillar is going to come out early, probably April or May, whereas two-spotted spider mites are going to be in the summertime when it's hot and dry. What are the host plants of insects and mite pests? Well, certain pests feed on a very narrow range of plants, whereas other insect and mite pests feed on a lot of different plants. Japanese beetles, for example, feeds on over 300 different plant species. Bagworms feed on a lot more plants than people think they do. Although they've been restricted to conifers, that's not so. They feed on a lot of broadleaf plants. Whereas eastern tent caterpillar feeds primarily on plants in the Rosaceae family: cherry, plum, crabapple. So what about number 3? What are the damaging life stages? Well, not all the life stages of an insect and mite pest are damaging. The larvae and or adults. In addition, some of the life stages are in the soil, like Japanese beetle. We'll talk about that. So sometimes the larvae or caterpillars are damaging, but the adults are not. Example, bagworms. The bagworm larva or caterpillar are the damaging life stage. The adult males and females are not the damaging life stage. Okay. And then the fourth one is, what is the mobility or ability to disperse of insect pests? A lot of insect pests are going to move either by flying or by wind currents. And the larvae bagworms are caught in wind currents. We call that ballooning, and that's how they get on plants. Where the adults are dispersing basically by wings, because the adult moths have wings. Okay, so it's always important to kind of look at seasonality, the host plants, the damaging life stage, and the mobility of the designated insect pests. Got that? Let's move on. So insect and mite pests that feed early in the growing season have a greater impact on plant growth and development than insect and mite pests that feed later in the growing season. And the reason for that, as you can guess, is if they continue to feed on the leaves, the plant can't manufacture food via photosynthesis. So that has a greater impact on both the growth and vigor of a plant early in the growing season. And a good example of that is the eastern tent caterpillar. It comes out April, May, and whenever crab apples are putting out their leaves, they're out there feeding on them. Speaking of which, there it is, the eastern tent caterpillar. This is the caterpillar stage. This material right here is the fecal material. As you can tell, the caterpillar eats a lot of leaves. And if you stick your hand in there, it's very warm. So on a nice cold April day, you stick your hand in there and it's quite warm. But again, this is an example of one of our early feeders. Fall webworm, which we're seeing the second generation right now, is basically one of our later feeders. But again, it's a caterpillar. You can see these are the caterpillar right here, and they reside in their nests, which is unlike eastern tent caterpillar. So they take their home with them. And so this time of year, you'll see these nests in things like birch trees, or right now in hickory and walnut. If you take some of the back roads of Kansas, you'll see these nests. This is the second generation fall webworm. It's not going to damage the trees because the trees are getting into the mode of getting ready for wintertime. Besides, there really isn't much you can do about it. Okay, so this right now, as of August 10th, 2021, this is what we're looking at right now in the back roads of Kansas and even some landscapes. So, Japanese beetle adults. I give talks just on this pest. I'll be giving one next month. But the Japanese beetle adults are feeding on the leaves, okay? A chewing insect overall. And I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with the Japanese beetle. Remember, the Japanese beetle has about 11 to 14 white tufts of hair at the back of the abdomen. Very shiny, coppery colored elytra, or that's what we call the covering for the abdomen. And this is the damage. Tilia is one of their favorite hosts, but they cause, the term we use is skeletonization. They feed in between the veins, giving the leaves kind of a skeletonized appearance. But again, this is the damage caused by the adults. Now again, the Japanese beetle has an above ground life stage and below ground life stage. That's a turfgrass pest. So here we are in August, and the females that have mated with the males are going to be laying eggs. The larvae will emerge from those eggs, and then they will be a turfgrass pest for about 2 months before going down deeper in the soil profile to overwinter. Okay, so they're only out for about 3 months. Most of the life stage, like other insects out there, are in the soil. So remember that. There are insects that have all the life stages above ground, and then some insects that have some stages below ground and some above ground. So spider mites, right now, spider mites are a problem because of the hot, dry, excessively humid weather we're experiencing. That's how they thrive. Spider mites feed on a wide diversity of plant types, both conifers and broadleaves, and they're on the leaf underside. As I'll tell you, insects and mites are on the leaf underside because they're small and they burn up under sunlight. So that is one of the main reasons why they're on the leaf underside. These are the eggs laid by the female. This is a male, a female, and they get their name two spots because on their abdomen, they have two spots on both sides during the digestion of the food, which they basically are sucking out of the plant parts, primarily the mesophyll layer. Consequently, this is the damage you see from two-spotted spider mite. We call this damage, it's actually called stippling because each one of the cells has had the chlorophyll removed. Two-spotted spider mites feed within the mesophyll and epiderm and the chlorophyll content, therefore robbing the plant of its ability to manufacture food by means of photosynthesis. And right now we're seeing spider mite damage on tomato, euonymus, like here, and some conifers. So another insect pest that also we would consider Pearson sucking are the lace bugs. And lace bugs are out right now feeding on sycamore, oaks, azalea, cotoneaster, quince, things like that. They're not really going to cause significant damage, although some of the damage might be aesthetic. But again, on the leaf underside, you'll see these black nymphs. These are the black fecal deposits. And over on the upper right is the adult. And of course, it gets its name lace bugs because it has this lacy appearance as an adult. So this is the damage caused by lace bugs on oaks. Again, you get this stippling, speckling appearance because they're actually like spider mites feeding primarily in the cell contents in the mesophyll. Right now, there really isn't anything you need to do. Green lacewings, which are a beneficial, will feed on them. And what if you're really concerned about lace bugs on a small tree or shrub, just take a high pressure water spray and just dislodge them, which we'll talk about. Very easy to do. So I want to talk a little bit about scales. These right here are the scale nymphs and crawlers. The larger organisms are the females. Okay, so these are the nymphal stages, and these are the adults. It's important to know there are two types of scale. The first one is soft or bark scales, and they have a food canal that carries large quantities of plant sap from the phloem sieve tubes, that's the sugar content of the plant, resulting in the production of honeydew. Honeydew is a sticky liquid material that allows black sooty mold to grow on it. I'm sure many of you have seen black sooty mold on trees and shrubs. That's an indication that you have a phloem feeding insect like soft scales, but also whiteflies, mealybugs, and aphids. Now, the hard or armored scales, their food canal contains various kinds of cells, and they do not transport large quantities of plant sap. Hard scales basically ingest small quantities of plant sap. Consequently, they do not produce honeydew. So if you see scales on a plant and you see no honeydew, or you don't see ants or black sooty mold, because the ants are going to feed on the honeydew and protect these scales from the natural enemies, you know you're dealing with a hard scale. And then they use their long stylets to explore areas of the plant tissue, and they tend to feed on individual plant cells, not necessarily in the phloem sieve tubes. Okay, so let's talk about the several soft scales and harder armored scales. These are a listing of the soft scales outdoors we find in Kansas. Cottony maple scale, magnolia scale is really bad in Kansas City. We out Kermes and Lacanium scale. Okay, so these are just examples of some of the common soft scales that are outdoors in Kansas. Lacanium scale feeding on ball cypress, Taxodium disticum, is very common throughout Kansas. And again, you know it's a soft scale by the honeydew production, black sooty mold, and the presence of ants climbing up and down the tree to feed on the honeydew, but more importantly, protect the scale from its own natural enemies, including predators or parasitoids. Another major soft scale pest, which is really prevalent in Kansas City, is the magnolia scale. This is a later instar stage. They tend to feed on primarily only magnolia, star magnolia, magnolia stellata, southern magnolia, magnolia solangiana, and they're very difficult to control, especially on large magnolia trees. Well, we have an extension publication I developed last year called Magnolia Scale, Insect Pest and Magnolia Trees, which you can download off the website or go to the KSRE bookstore and get a PDF from there. Now, there are a wide diversity of hard scales, and hard scales tend to be very specific on the plant they feed upon. We have Euonymus scale, which is out right now, pine needle scale, and these are all common in most portions. Some of these will attack landscape trees, some will attack landscape plants in addition to fruit trees. So Euonymus scale is infesting Euonymus. This is what you'll see right about now. And then if you get a close-up look, the white individuals are the males, the brown ones are the females. So the males become a winged individual, they mate with the female, then she lays her complement of eggs underneath a waxy layer. Remember, Euonymus scale is a hard scale, so there's no honeydew production. So what they do is they build up all that excess, these exudates on top of their body, and you get this waxy covering. Well, guess what? We have an extension publication on that. Just came out this week. Euonymus scale insect pests of Euonymus plants grown in the landscapes. And again, you can access all of these from the KSRE bookstore. Another hard scale we tend to find quite prevalent in Kansas, on mugo pines especially, is the pine needle scale. Again, the scale is right there, and the white covering is where the eggs from the female are being laid, okay? The males, again, become a winged individual, and then they basically die out. And guess what? You got it, extension publication, pine needle scale insect pest of pine trees. So I wanted to just give you sort of a cursory overview of scales because they are major pests of landscape plants. And another extension publication I developed is sort of a general overview of scale insect pests. And in there you will find a listing, table 3, and it has all the hard scales and all the soft scales that are commonly encountered on trees and shrubs and landscapes in Kansas. Okay, got that? Now let's move into wood-boring insects. But let me just state emphatically that wood-boring insects are not the primary cause of plant death. They're very opportunistic. They come in when the plant is stressed, unhealthy, and they just basically come in and finish the job. There are 3 types of wood-boring insects. There are wood-boring beetles, caterpillars, and wasps. Due to the time limit I have, I just want to give you kind of a cursory overview of 1 or 2 beetle wood-boring insects and a caterpillar wood-boring insect pest. So wood-boring insects primarily attack stressed trees and shrubs. The volatile terpenes, hydrocarbons, and alcohols emitted by injured trees lure these wood-boring insects to them. So they hone in on the volatiles that allows the wood-boring insect, beetles, or moths, or butterflies to land, lay their eggs, and start the process. Now, healthy trees can defend themselves. They can do this 2 ways, by either compartmentalizing the injury, and that isolates the insect and kills it, and then they can reestablish the integrity of the cambium, which is where the phloem is, and the vascular tissues, okay? Number 2 is they can actually entomb the larvae in hospital environment, basically the Jurassic Park method of drowning them in resin, basically. When they're healthy, they have a lot of resin flow. And if a wood-boring insect attacks a healthy tree, the healthy tree can basically cover it with resin and suffocate it. And that will basically stop any infestation. Well, prolonged drought reduces resistance of trees and shrubs to the point where they can't overcome attack by bark beetles. And it's really critical during dry conditions or droughty conditions to water your plant thoroughly so they can defend themselves against insect pests such as bark beetles. The bark beetles can overcome resistance by mass attack. And again, this is primarily going to occur on stressed trees. They basically overwhelm the defenses, and then they give off pheromones that are released to attract both males and females of the same species. So basically, it's like gang up on this tree, overwhelm it, And basically, the tree can't defend itself, and they feed upon it and eventually kill it. So the susceptibility of a tree does depend on several factors. That includes plant vigor and plant age. Older plants tend to be more susceptible than younger ones. But again, what's really critical is providing water, fertilizer, mulching, pruning occasionally to keep those plants as healthy as possible. Because then they can defend themselves against some of these wood-boring insects. Got that? Okay. So how does this work? Well, on the left is the adult. The adult is coming out of a hole, and they will feed on the foliage. Really, the adults don't do much damage. They will feed on the foliage, they mate, and then the female will lay her complement of eggs on the surface of the bark, usually up from 1 foot to 6 feet, probably about from the bottom of the soil surface to about 6 feet up. Those eggs, then the larvae emerge and they tunnel straight in and they start feeding in the vascular tissues, whether that be the cambium or the sapwood. Some of them do get in the heartwood. And the larva is the one causing the damage. By feeding, as you can see here, the plant's going to eventually not be able to obtain water and nutrients. And then you're going to start seeing dieback, sudden death of the branches. So this is what the larval stage can do in a tree. These are the galleries caused by the larva right underneath the bark. These holes are where the adults either entered or left the tree. Either the females would come and lay their eggs, or the adults are coming out after pupation. So here's an example of a very pretty borer called the cottonwood borer. It looks like the Asian longhorn beetle, but it's not. That is still somewhat east of us. I hope it stays that way. But example of a longhorn beetle. Okay. Again, the adult's not causing the damage, other than maybe feeding on foliage. It's the larva inside the tree that's responsible for causing plant death. Okay. So in addition to wood-boring beetles, we have wood-boring caterpillars. And this is an example of a male and female ash lilac borer copulating. I do apologize for that, but when insects are having sex, they don't move very fast. You get some really quality images, as I have found out in my entomological career, which spans about 30 years. Okay, so once the mating occurs, the female then will go to an ash or lilac tree, lay her eggs on the bark. The caterpillars emerge, tunnel into the shrub or tree, and start feeding within inside of it. Okay, so this is what the larva does inside the tree. It's feeding. There are the head. This is the thorax and the abdomen. And sometimes you'll see on the lower right a tree basically exuding liquid. That might be an indication that a wood-boring insect, in this case, the lilac or ash borer, is feeding on it. Okay. The way you can tell if lilac or ash borers are infesting your trees is look for the brown pupal cases. This is where the adults emerge. And has anybody seen this? I thought so, yeah. So a really good identification for diagnosis, indicating that the trees had been infested by ash or lilac borer. Here's an example of a tree. You can see all of the pupal cases that were in the tree, and this is the typical dieback. You see over 50% of the tree is dying back, a little bit of green, but in this case, just do a basal application and cut the tree down, okay? You're not gonna save it. It's lost all of its aesthetic appeal, and you're never gonna rejuvenate the tree at this point, okay? So again, but that tree was probably stressed, and my guess is, this is the old Lawrence rest stop, and I do remember that the lawn or turf grass was right up against the trunk. And can anybody tell me what probably was responsible for the tree going downhill? You got it, mower blight and weed eater blight. They had bumped it so many times that the tree basically was getting girdled, and then the lilac or ash borer said, ha ha, that tree is stressed. We're gonna attack it, and that's exactly what they did. So how can you tell when a tree or a shrub has been attacked by a wood-boring insect? Well, number one, you can look at the exit holes. There are two types of exit holes. These are the D-shaped exit holes, and another one are round exit holes. Now that's for wood-boring beetles. Now, if it's a wood-boring caterpillar, you'll find sawdust at the base of a tree. Wood-boring beetles do not exude sawdust. They actually pack their galleries with their wood shavings or frass. But caterpillar borers expel it out. And that's how you can tell the difference between a wood-boring caterpillar infesting a tree and a wood-boring beetle. Okay? So those are just some signs you could look for if the tree is going downhill. So let's talk about some plant protection strategies. That is insect and mite pest management. There are 4 basic types. There's cultural, that is providing water, fertility, mulching, and sanitation, that is cleaning up debris, because many of the insects and mite pests out there, not just those that attack trees and shrubs, but also vegetable gardens, they overwinter in debris. And so raking it up, shredding it, or disposing of it is one way to minimize any overwintering sites for the wintertime. Physical, pruning, hand removal, and one of my favorites is a high pressure water spray. I sort of mentioned that with lace bugs, and we'll get more into detail as we proceed through the presentation. I'm not going to spend too much time on insecticides and miticides, just a couple of slides. You can ask me some questions if you like. And biological. Biological is utilizing the beneficial insects, including parasitoids and predators, that are providing a free regulatory process. Okay, and what I'll talk about is the ecological impact of using pesticides on beneficial insects. Okay, so physical management includes hand removal, hand picking, high pressure water spray, pruning, traps, and barriers. So for bagworms, so right now bagworms, and we'll get more into bagworms pretty soon, they're not feeding. They're inside the bags. They're in what we call the brown or green cap stage. And they're kind of thinking of, well, the males are going to become a winged black moth and the females are going to sit there and after mating lay her complement of up to 1,000 eggs. So handpicking each bag that has a female, it does you no good to remove the male bags, but those with a female, think about as removing potentially 1,000 offspring for next year, okay? Now, when I say high pressure water spray, I'm not alluding to this because this will blow your trees out of the ground and probably physically harm them. There's no doubt about it. But a high pressure water spray, like you used to wash your car, it's very beneficial because it quickly removes all the life stages of insect and mite pest. Now remember, you have to get on the leaf underside because that's where mites and insect pests are located. If you just hit the top of the leaves, that's not going to do very much in reducing the populations. It cleans plants, removes the dust. You preserve beneficial insects such as parasitoids and predators because there's no residues. You're not, spraying with a material that'll last several weeks. It's a very quick and easy way to remove insects, but not disrupt beneficial insects for a long period of time. And if you do this about twice a week, you can prevent insect and mite pest populations from building up and consequently avoid sudden outbreaks. Like right now, spider mites would be one example of that. Okay? Now remember, water is not a registered pesticide. So you want to make sure you do this in the evening when nobody sees you so you don't get in trouble by the regulatory processes. Another way of removing insects very quickly is pruning out the damage. Fall webworm is a good example. Fall webworm, you have these isolated webs, just basically prune it out. You can give it to your neighbor if you want, but I recommend you put it in a bag in the sun and let it burn up, or shred it, or just get it out of there as soon as possible, okay? So pruning, again, is a quick and easy way of removing insect and some mite pests. Okay, when you're using insecticides and miticides, you need to remember 3 concepts. Timing. You'll want to apply your insecticides and miticides when the most susceptible life stages. This includes larvae, nymph, or adult are present. The pupal stage and the eggs, in general, are resilient. Most insecticides and miticides out there will not kill those 2 life stages. So you want to make sure you got larvae, nymphs, or adults present. Number 2 is coverage. When applying or spraying an insecticide or miticide, it is critical and important to obtain thorough coverage of all plant parts, but primarily the underside of the leaves and the stems, because that's where most insect and mite pests are located. And number 3 is the frequency. You want to apply your insecticides and miticides within timely intervals, which is dependent on the residual activity of a given insecticide or miticide. So what that means is if you're using like an insecticidal soap with very short residual activity, you're going to have to apply it more frequently than you would another insecticide that has maybe 4 weeks residual, okay? And that information is on the label. So you want to read the label and follow directions associated with frequency of application. So again, it's timing, coverage, and frequency. And again, what's really important to understand? All the life stages, egg, adult, nymphs, pupa, larva, are on leaf undersides. That's where you want to get your coverage. And that's as a result of that, you'll have higher mortality of the insect or mite pests. Okay, you got that? Charlie, I see you out there. You got it? Yeah, I can, okay. So, what about some of the ecological impact of pesticide use on beneficial insects? There are 2 terms. One is secondary pest outbreak. The second one is pest resurgence. What do they mean? Well, let's explain them. Let's say, for example, Charlene out there has aphids on her roses, and they're getting pretty bad, but also what she doesn't see is spider mites on her roses, and they're kind of being regulated by predatory mites. Okay, that's good. Well, Charlene goes ahead and sprays a malathion, an old organophosphate. She kills all the aphids, but what else does she kill? All the predatory mites that were regulating the 2-spotted spider mite pest. And what happens is the 2-spotted spider mite becomes her primary pest. Aphids are still there, but she still has to spray. This right here is called the pesticide treadmill. You have basically disrupted the ecosystem, and now you have a primary pest, which used to be a secondary pest, and your primary pest is still there, but it's not the primary pest anymore. That's what we call a secondary pest outbreak, and it happens every summer. I'll get a call from somebody saying, Dr. Cloyd, why are my euonymus bushes losing their leaves? And I say, well, have you used Carbaryl 7? Yes, I use it 3 days a week. Well, you've killed all the predatory mites, and now your 2-spotted spider mites are taking over and causing your euonymus leaves to lose their leaves. That's what's happening. Pest resurgence basically means you spray with malathion, you kill the aphids, but you also kill the beneficial insects. And so the pest resurges at a higher level than it was before the application, because there's a lag time before the beneficial insects can catch up with the pest population. So there's secondary pest outbreak and there's target pest resurgence, or we've shortened it down to pest resurgence. Those are ecological consequences, unintended consequences of using pesticides. Okay, so when you're going to use an insecticide, miticide, be cognizant of the ecological ramifications when you do a spray application. Okay, let's talk about the state insect of Kansas, bagworm. It should be, but basically I want to put together everything we've talked about and relate it to this one specific pest, which everybody just loves. Bagworms, of course, get their name because they form the bags and what they're feeding upon. This is a very young bagworm or bag, the caterpillar's inside, about May or June. And of course, as they're feeding, they get bigger. So this is the caterpillar's inside the bag, it protects it. And then they'll come out and feed, but they don't come all out. Their head and part of their abdomen protrude. And then if they get disturbed, they go back into the bag to protect themselves. And this is the damage they can cause. If you don't deal with bagworms, they are voracious feeders, and this is what they'll do to a Thulia or arborvitae. And this is what they can do to juniper. That was a juniper, and you can see the other plant around it. It doesn't take long for many junipers to finally defoliate a tree. Okay. And this is in my yard. I did a study, very limited study, only one replication, but this is a Thulia that had bagworms that I let go. My wife wasn't too keen on it, but she did let me get one replication in, and basically this killed it. Remember, conifers do not put out new growth after they've lost the foliage. And so this is, again, what if you don't deal with bagworms, this is the consequences, and that is plant death, especially on young plants like this thuya. So here are so there's the caterpillar, and if you took the caterpillar out there, that's the female. She's getting ready to lay her eggs. And right now, this is what bagworms are doing. This is the green or brown cap stage, and each female bag can contain between 500 to 1,000 eggs. That's how they overwinter, as I showed you earlier. Bagworms overwinter as eggs inside the bag of the dead female. So that's why I recommend hand picking the female bags, and then you put them in some soapy water. You can put them on the ground and squish them, whatever you want. And by killing the eggs, you can minimize up to 1,000 offspring coming in for next year. So if you squeeze the bag, that's what the caterpillar would look like right now. This is what I've been doing in my lab study we're doing with bagworms, and you kind of squeeze it, and you'll see them kind of pop their head out. Now, if you really want to have some fun, I know about fun, but if you really squish them hard enough, then you'll get bagworm goo popping out the back. And we have kids that will grab these bags and they'll squirt each other. It's kind of a cheap person's version of paintball, and they end up covering themselves with green goo. But it's a really good way to control bagworms or minimize problems for next year. Get a bunch of kids together and have them do a bagworm goo squishing contest. Absolutely fun. So this is the life stage when they're about a 1/4 inch or less that you want to apply your insecticides. Obviously, we missed it this year. You're too late now, but be aware the younger the insect is, the easier it is to kill. Okay? So this is what bagworms are doing right now, and it's too late. This is the brown or green cap stage, and they're inside getting ready to become either a male or a female. Okay? So your options, again, are only handpicking. So one material that I recommend, because it's very selective, is Bacillus thuringiensis kiristaki. It's also known as BTK. And for those of you from Wichita, I have to apologize because that does mean something else, although I did hear they resolved the issue. But this is our most selective insecticide and only kills caterpillars. And it's very effective as on bagworms, but they have to eat it. It's a stomach poison. It's not a contact. That's why you get it out early, because the earlier you get it out there, the younger the caterpillars, the faster they're killed. So the timing of application, again, is important. You make applications of BTK when bagworms are young and actively feeding, about a 1/4 inch or less, because less material is required to kill the bagworms, and the bagworms get killed quickly. Okay? That's one material. My favorite is spinosad. And the reason is I worked with this product when it was a numbered compound 4 years before it came out. It is, to me, in my mind's eye, the best material for bagworms. It's also a stomach poison. And just like BTK, you have to get out there when they're young. But let me tell you, this year I sprayed just once in June on my thuyas and junipers, and I have no bagworms on my junipers or thuya. Again, it's timing. Get them when they're young, and you're going to get very high mortality. When they're over an inch long, you can't use these products. You have to use some of the harsher materials, and of course, they're toxic to pollinators and natural enemies or beneficial insects. Okay. So I did develop a bagworm extension publication 2 years ago. And basically, if you read this, and you can download it or get it from the KSRE bookstore, this is what I say. Insecticides should be applied when bagworm larvae are an 1/8 to 1/4 inches long. Small larvae are more susceptible than larger, older larvae. Starting in late May, now that'll vary depending on temperature, apply insecticides once a week for 4 weeks. Now, again, because of the delay, and we had kind of lower populations than we saw the last 4 years, I only had to do 1 application. Some people had to do more because the eggs do not all hatch simultaneously, and also the bagworms will balloon in, which means they go to the top of a tree, form a silken strand, and they get carried by wind currents, and they can be carried miles. I know people call me that have windbreaks in western Kansas, and they said, we've never had bagworms, but we have this year. And of course, it's windy in Kansas, and that's how they get moved around. Okay? So you can download this publication from the KSRE bookstore and read it. So as we get close and near, I want to talk about some new extension publications that have been developed. I have a new Oakley Fitch Mite publication, bagworms, scale insects, magnolia scale, pine needle scale, new Japanese beetle one, elm leaf beetle, and the one hot off the press, Yanama scale. Okay, these are the websites, and again, it's all based on the KSRE bookstore. That's where you can get your free PDF. Okay, I know you can't write all this down, but I can make it available to Ariel, and she can distribute it to you people, or contact me, and I'll send you a copy of it. There are also other publications we have out there. This is the tree and shrub problems in Kansas. It includes diseases, insects, and environmental stresses. It was supposed to be revised last year, but it's still on hold, but it is still a viable publication. This is a publication I was involved in early 2000s called the IPM Midwest Landscapes. Very good publication, lots of quality images, biology, ecology, everything about control, non-chemical, chemical for the major pests in the Midwest. I believe you can get this still online from Amazon or some other source, but I would recommend this for every master gardener out there. And of course, there's a second edition of the Garden Insects of North America by Whitney Cranshaw and Dave Shetler. Mostly pictures. It's mostly for identification more than anything else. It doesn't provide any information about management or things like that. Okay, now, you thought you're going to get away with this presentation without some kind of knowledge enhancement or quiz or mind thinker. Before I do that, though, our 16th president was very astute when he said, don't believe everything you read on the internet just because there's a picture with a quote next to it. The internet is a very, let's just say it's a source of information contamination. There's lots of misinformation there, and by being a master gardener and contacting the extension offices, that's where you're going to get some reliable information. Okay, so does anybody know what these are? Give you a couple minutes. Does anybody know what these are? You see them probably in midsummer going into fall. Are they scales? Charlie? Charlene? Pete? Well, what they are is, let me get the drum roll, katydid eggs. Those are katydid eggs. They can be confused. They look like scale, but they're actually katydid eggs, okay? So just, again, identification is number one. So that's all I have for you this afternoon. And I want to thank you for your attention. I hope you all learned something, had fun, stretch your mind a little bit. And with that, if you have any feedback, there's my email address. Any advice, ideas, responses, opinions, survey, Ariel mentioned that, comments, please don't hesitate to email me. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ariel, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Cloyd. Kevin is monitoring the chat. So if you all have any questions that you want to ask, please go ahead and drop those in the chat, and I'll let Kevin start to organize them. But I want to kick us off, Dr. Cloyd. We had talked right before the program started about the number one question we're getting, which is fall armyworms. Can you talk about those just briefly? Because I think a lot of people are starting to see them.
Yeah, a fall armyworm is a caterpillar, and basically they come up from the south primarily. As adults, the females lay the eggs, and then we get these caterpillars, and they can run into billions. Well, technically the billions. We know we've seen them crossing roads, and people run over them, and they skid. But basically, they feed on turf grass, they feed on wheat and agronomic crops, and really the only thing you can do is just pick them up. And sometimes they're not even going to cause much damage. But if they are feeding on your turf grass, you're probably going to want to treat with some type of insecticide, primarily pyrethroid that's out there, like a bifenthrin, cyfluthrin, those types, because they can cause substantial plant damage, especially on greens or really manicured turf grass. Yeah.
And that's where we've been seeing them coming in as a lot of turf grass. So thank you for answering that. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anybody have anything they're brave enough to ask? You're probably too thorough, Dr. Cloyd. You may have answered all our questions before we get
I don't think so, Ariel. Lots of questions. Yeah.
We did get a question from Mary. She said that she's got aphids on her tropical milkweed. Usually ladybugs or lacewings come and eat them, but she's not seeing any around. Is there a lack of them? Is there something else she should be doing to encourage those beneficials to come in?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, milkweed, of course, is growing, and milkweed, of course, is the larval food for the monarch butterfly. But in addition, you'll also get the milkweed aphid, and it's the orange, yellow aphid. And sometimes the numbers are so great that the beneficial insects cannot keep up. So I have seen ladybird beetle adults and larvae. I've seen syrphid fly larvae feeding. But really the numbers are very low. And and the thing is, you need to remove them, because if the aphids are feeding on those milkweeds, the larva will not pick up enough won't pick up toxins to make the adult non-poisonous. So what I would go out there with a high pressure water spray is dislodge the aphids and allow that plant to produce the carotid which are the toxins that the larva uses. They metabolize it, and it's what makes the monarch butterfly poisonous to birds. So it's really critical to keep those aphids off the plants, but it's going to take more than one time. You may have to do it several times. Yeah, that's right. You do that, they'll come back. So it's like twice a week. Just dislodge them and prevent them from building up in large numbers on your milkweeds.
And Dr. Cloyd, correct me if I'm wrong, but on aphids, isn't sort of the name of their game just to have a lot of babies? I've heard that the females can be born pregnant. And so, when Mary's talking about struggling, it's probably just because they are such fast at reproduction.
Yeah, indoors in greenhouses, there are no males. So in indoors, you can get the females giving birth to live offspring. That's called parthenogenesis. Outdoors, it can happen, but it depends on the aphid species. Outdoors, aphids, as I alluded to, can overwinter as eggs, but you also have males. But in a lot of cases, aphids can produce tremendous amounts of offspring. In fact, there was a study done looking at green peach aphid, and after 5 generations, they got 13 million individuals. So again, that's why you need to continually be on top of it, because of that high reproductive capacity.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Cloyd? I really can't help myself, so I'll ask another question, because my area is not entomology. So it's always so super helpful to have you come, because we get a lot of entomology questions. You said that you had just updated the oak leaf itch mite publication. What kind of information? I know when you first put it out, when we were first experiencing that, we didn't have a lot of research to show control or really tell us much about the insect. Is there anything new in that update of that publication?
Well, it's a mite, Ariel, not an insect.
Yes,
really,
I'm so sorry, a mite.
all right, I won't hold you to it. Really, there isn't anything new, and the reason is because remember 14, 15, 16 were very bad years. I remember you asked me to give a talk at the Kansas Garden Show, and the average attendance was about 30 to 40. There were 150 people there. But really, we haven't had the infestations like 14, 15, 16, and that's based on the fact that the leaf gall folder on pin oaks has not been prevalent. And of course, if you don't know the oak leaf itch mite biology, the oak leaf itch mite feeds on the larval stage of that midge. So if your pin oaks are not showing any galls, you're not going to have any oak leaf itch mites. Really, there's no new information in the Ariel, but it has been updated. We talk about tanglefoot applications to stop them from moving up, but really, They haven't been the issue they were in 14, 15, 16. We've had occasional outbursts in Kansas City, but again, if in your yard, if you see your pin oaks with the leaves curling over themselves, then you might want to be ready for oak leaf itch mite, because that means the oak leaf marginal gall folder is active, and the oak leaf itch mite will use that midge larva as a food source.
That's great. And you're right, we haven't actually gotten any reports of it in our office since I think 2017. We had a couple, and that's been the last time. We have people that come in thinking they have oak leaf itch mites, but it's around their ankles and legs, and so most likely chiggers. So thank you for that, though. We get a lot of questions, I think, because they were so bad for so many years that people are really concerned.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it looks like we have a shy bunch today. I'm not seeing any other questions popping up in the chat. Just a reminder to all of you, we have recorded this session. We'll send out an email tomorrow with the survey and the recording. Thank you so much to Dr. Cloyd for your time and your expertise today. Also really appreciate Kevin Seek helping out in the chat. And thank you all for joining us. Make sure to tune in next week for Nuisance Wildlife with Dr. Drew Ricketts. Thank you.
Bye, Ariel. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.